If you are not good enough, then shut up and give up your seat.
Okay. But remember, whose signature is keeping this company standing?
At the exact moment I began outlining the federal updates, the CEO threw up a hand like he was stopping traffic. Hold that thought. Miles, we have someone far more current to take it from here. The room shifted, 26 people turning toward the doors as Nephew strutted in, smiling as if this was a coronation rather than a project review. I felt the shock hit first, sharp and humiliating. But I stayed where I was, laser still. "Everyone," the CEO announced. "Meet the young man who's going to modernize everything around here." His nephew cleared his throat, tapped the microphone, and said, "Thanks, I'm excited to lead this, federal Wi-Fi upgrade program." A few people snorted, then tried to hide it behind coughs. Federal Wi-Fi upgrade. The actual contract funded a multi-year national systems initiative. Hearing him butcher the name made something in my chest tighten, then sink. If you've ever watched someone unqualified take credit for the work you bled for, tell me where are you listening from right now? Your story matters as much as mine. But don't hit subscribe unless you genuinely want to know what really happened next. I stood there, the outgoing project lead, watching a boy who still had a gaming headset tan line mislabel the most sensitive contract we'd ever handled. The pain from that moment didn't flare. It compressed, smaller, tighter, quieter. I kept my face calm, almost gentle. And that seemed to unsettle the CEO more than any argument could have. He hurried things along, sliding a stack of papers toward his nephew. "Just sign here. It's standard." The kid didn't even skim it. He scribbled his signature fast, proud, carefree. The room clapped politely. Nobody seemed to notice the header on the first page, Federal Program Custodian Transfer, Preliminary Acceptance. Not internal forms, not routine. Federal. I looked at the signature drying on the line and felt the last hint of warmth drain out of me. Not anger, not disbelief, just cold clarity. If this was the future of the company, then the company had no idea what kind of trouble it had just invited in. And as I stepped back from the podium, letting the applause fade behind me, one thought settled sharply into place. They hadn't replaced me. They'd removed their only safety rail. Quiet settled over me the moment I walked out of that conference room, the kind of quiet that shows up only after a public humiliation. I didn't cry, didn't curse, didn't even clench my fists. I just felt everything inside me switch to a low, dull hum, as if 17 years of effort had been muted in one afternoon. Maybe that's why my mind drifted back to where those 17 years had actually gone, to the midnight inspections where I stood alone in freezing server rooms, to the night I stopped a cascading failure with one hand while the other held pressure on a cut that needed 6 stitches, to the quiet dinners I ate in the conference room, forgotten on the calendar, my food always cold by the time I opened the container. All those years, and somehow I was still the most invisible person in the building. Meanwhile, the CEO's nephew, who once sent a client's confidential report to a gaming chat by accident, got welcomed like he was the second coming of innovation. He'd been fired from 2 companies for carelessness, but somehow he was the one chosen to modernize federal operations. I tried to laugh at the irony, but it sat in my chest like a bruise. Still, numb calm carried me through the evening, right up until I opened the secure archive tied to my old federal account. There, tucked between routine compliance notes, was last year's federal performance review. The final line stopped me cold. Project continuity requirement must be validated by Miles Porter. For someone supposedly outdated, that was one hell of a sentence. I leaned back in my chair and let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "So, I'm not important?" "Huh," I murmured, feeling something colder and sharper settle into place, seeing my name printed in that tone formal. Absolute, non-negotiable hit me harder than any insult earlier. It reminded me that while the company had forgotten my work, the federal system hadn't missed a thing. I sat there replaying the afternoon, feeling that familiar ache rise in my throat, the one that shows up when you realize you gave everything to a place that could erase you with one announcement. But even in that ache, a small, almost petty part of me couldn't resist whispering, "Well, at least somebody knows what I actually did." After a few minutes, I closed the archive and leaned back, letting the numbness settle again. I wasn't angry anymore, just disappointed in a way that felt heavier than rage. Maybe that's what 17 years does to a person. You stop expecting applause, and you learn to interpret silence like a language. And tonight, silence told me the truth the company wouldn't. I mattered more than they ever admitted. The nephew had swagger, charm, and a talent for messing up simple tasks, but he didn't have this history, this record, this proof. And as strange as it sounds, that realization didn't warm me. It simply steadied me, that clarity. Most people skim this part, but you don't, right? The house felt unusually quiet when I walked in, the kind of quiet that follows you like a shadow after a day that takes something out of you. I set my keys on the counter, glanced toward my home office, and stopped. My desk looked emptier than it ever had. No badge, no binder, no stack of files waiting for my review, just a blank surface staring back at me as if the last 17 years had been erased with one swipe of a hand. The silence pressed in, steady and heavy, and for a moment I just stood there, feeling the ache of being replaced settle somewhere deep in my ribs. I finally sat down and opened my laptop, expecting nothing more than the usual subscription emails and automated alerts, but I clicked on my personal inbox anyway, the one I rarely used except for federal correspondence. The glow of the screen felt colder tonight as I scrolled. A subject line caught my eye. Request for final attestation, Federal Oversight Office. My breath stilled. I clicked it open. The message was direct. We require your signature to complete the official transition of project custodianship. Please submit final attestation within 3 business days to prevent compliance interruption. 3 days. My signature? Federal requirement? The words hit with a slow, pulsing pain like pressing on a bruise you didn't realize was still tender. I leaned back in my chair as the ache sharpened. They had replaced me in public like I was disposable. Yet here was the federal government reminding me, in the most bureaucratic tone possible, that I wasn't just part of the project. I was the hinge it turned on, and without my signature. The law was clear, continuity suspended. Contract frozen, operations halted, the nephew, the CEO, the entire board. They hadn't replaced me. They had simply created a gap only I could fill. That thought didn't soothe the wound, but it did cool the edges. The pain didn't vanish, it just changed shape. It became something quieter, firmer, almost metallic. I read the email again, slower this time, letting its implications settle. Then I closed my laptop, stood up, and turned off the light. Darkness filled the room, but it didn't feel suffocating. It felt clarifying. I sank into my chair and let out a long breath, the kind that empties out more than air. And somewhere in that darkness, a small, sharp smile pulled at the corner of my mouth, not warm, not triumphant, just precise. The kind of smile that shows up when the truth finally stops hurting and starts making sense. Don't comment yet. The next paragraph will make you change your mind. I woke up the next morning feeling strangely steady, as if the chaos of yesterday had burned itself out and left only a cool, controllable calm behind. My phone, however, had other ideas. The screen lit up with a solid wall of missed calls, 21 from the CEO alone. Each one lined up like a stack of increasingly desperate attempts to erase his brilliant display of arrogance. I let the phone vibrate on the table while I made coffee, its rattling buzz almost funny against the quiet kitchen. By the time I sat down with my mug, the calls had stopped, replaced by a single incoming number I recognized instantly, the nephew. I let it ring twice, mostly out of curiosity. Before answering, his voice came through thin, wobbly, and painfully unprepared. Miles, hey, so I think there's a form or something that needs your signature. I nearly laughed, truly, but I kept my tone even. A form. Really, I thought you were the future of the company. The silence on his end stretched long enough for me to imagine him blinking fast, trying to decide whether I was teasing him. I was softly. He muttered something about urgent compliance flags before hanging up abruptly in a swirl of panic. I set the phone down, lifted my coffee, and waited. Because of course there was more. Sure enough, I heard the alert before the notification appeared, an email ping from the federal system tied to my old credentials. The subject line glowed with bureaucratic dread. Automated notice compliance review initiated. I opened it slowly, already guessing what disaster had unfolded. And there it was. Spelled out in the coldest government language, the nephew had uploaded an internal draft file to the federal portal instead of the required monthly summary. A file containing half-finished notes, stray comments, and at least one line where he complained the project was way too complicated for the salary. Triggering an early federal review isn't simple, but incompetence has a talent for opening doors no one asked it to. I leaned back and let out a soft, amused breath. If I told anyone this, they'd think I was making it up. Seconds later, another email slid into my inbox from the CEO, Miles. We're experiencing a minor issue. Please call me as soon as possible. Minor was a generous word for the storm now forming directly above his head, I typed back. Slow and polite. I'm sure you are. Then I closed my laptop and finally enjoyed my coffee. Feeling something shift inside me, not anger, not bitterness, but the clean, solid weight of control returning. Their panic was accelerating, but I felt nothing except clarity. And for the first time since yesterday, I wasn't moving on their terms. I was choosing my own. There was something in the back that no one expected. I knew something was coming the moment my phone vibrated with the distinctive federal chime, the one I hadn't heard since the day before everything fell apart. When I opened my inbox, the message sat at the top like a verdict waiting to be read. Monthly report rejected. Signature invalid. Recognized custodian Miles Porter. Cold, official, and precise. I didn't feel anger. I didn't even feel surprise. What I felt was control sliding quietly back into my hands, smooth and familiar, like a tool I had never actually set down. A few minutes later, an identical message reached the board of directors. I knew because the federal system, in all its rigid efficiency, seed me on every communication involving my name. I took a slow sip of coffee while imagining the chaos erupting in the executive wing. The federal stamp alone was enough to ruin a quarter's worth of planning. The line about me being the only recognized custodian that was the spark landing in a room full of dry paper. The nephew must have been the first to lose color. I pictured him staring at the rejection notice, hands clammy, eyes wide, mumbling excuses no one had asked for. According to the automated alerts hitting my inbox, he had attempted to resubmit the report 3 separate times. Each attempt failed for a different reason: wrong signature, wrong project code, wrong classification tag. 3 mistakes in a row, 3 federal rejections. If it weren't so serious, it might have been hilarious. Actually, it was hilarious. The federal notice triggered an automatic freeze, funds locked, project paused, all activity held until a valid signature was submitted. And since I was the only valid signature on record, the entire contract now sat in limbo, untouchable. I leaned back in my chair, letting the dark amusement settle. People spend years clawing for leverage. Mine arrived packaged in bureaucratic language and time-stamped at 7:43 in the morning. Then came the email from the CEO. The subject line was the kind of understatement executives use when they're on the verge of screaming Miles. We're facing a small complication. Small. Yes. And the Titanic experienced a small inconvenience with ice. The body of the message begged me politely, desperately, formally to review the recent submission for accuracy. I typed a short reply. I'm sure you are. Nothing more. Within moments, another automated CC from the federal system arrived, this time detailing a scheduled compliance audit triggered by the failed submissions. An early audit rare, intrusive, and expensive. I chuckled softly into my coffee. It was almost artful how quickly everything unraveled without me lifting a finger. The flood of emails kept coming, but none of them changed the reality the project was frozen. The board was panicking, and every federal alert being sent to the company was also arriving in my inbox by design. I sat there in the steady morning light, reading each one with a growing, quiet smile. Control never shouted when it returned. It simply sat down beside you, poured a cup of coffee, and made itself comfortable. There is a small change, but if you don't want to dig deeper, then ignore it. I walked into the 6 o'clock emergency meeting with the kind of quiet authority that doesn't require an introduction. The room was already vibrating with panic papers scattered, voices overlapping, chairs scraping the floor. It looked less like a boardroom and more like the aftermath of a storm nobody had predicted. I took my seat without a word, and the silence that followed landed harder than any accusation. People sometimes forget that silence can hold more power than shouting. The lead partner from our largest federal collaborator was already on screen, his expression carved from stone. "This contract will not move forward," he said flatly, "unless Mr. Porter is present and verifies custodianship." That was his opening statement, no greeting, no softening, just my name, delivered like a requirement, not a suggestion. Across the table, the CEO's nephew flushed red with anger. "Why does everyone keep talking about Miles?" he snapped, slamming his palm on the table. "I'm the one in charge now." The CEO turned toward him, face darkening. "Because you don't have authority here," he hissed, every syllable trembling with frustration. "And you never did." The room froze. Even I had to admit that hearing him say it aloud carried a satisfying sting before anyone could speak again. The conference screen blinked, and a new window opened. Federal Oversight Delivery Custodian Record Compilation. The partners leaned in. So did the board. I folded my hands, already knowing what it contained. The system began scrolling through its files, line by line. 132 federal reports, 12 security evaluations, 6 unannounced inspections. Every single document displayed the same signature at the bottom: Miles Porter. My name repeated in neat, consistent strokes, like a heartbeat across 12 years of work. I watched the room absorb it, slowing, stiffening, going still. Even the nephew, who always carried the confidence of someone who had never earned anything, sank back into his chair. Then came the final page, one sentence, centered and bold, appearing with the quiet finality of a gavel strike. "This project's integrity relies on Miles Porter." Nobody spoke. Nobody even breathed loudly. The shift in the room was instant, an axis tilting, gravity reassigning itself. I felt the moment settle over me, not like a victory, but like a truth reclaiming its place. The CEO swallowed hard, his bravado drained away. The board members looked at me with a mixture of guilt and dawning comprehension. The federal partner nodded once, as if to say, "There it is." And the nephew, once loud, brash, and certain he'd inherit an empire, looked like someone watching the ground disappear under his feet. For the first time since my public replacement, the balance of power snapped cleanly back where it belonged, not because I demanded it, not because I fought for it, but because the system itself had spoken, and it spoke in my name. The pivot had happened, and everyone in that room knew it. The collapse didn't arrive with explosions or shouting. It arrived quietly, one alert at a time, like a row of dominoes tipping in slow motion. The first notification hit early in the morning. Our primary partner announced they were pulling all discretionary funding until custodianship concerns were resolved. I read the email while tying my shoes. Cold, factual, irreversible. By the time I finished breakfast, the second strike landed. The federal portal rejected another submission, this time without even offering a warning. Report denied. Signature invalid, pending suspension. I almost admired the efficiency. A few minutes later came the third message, the one that froze the entire compliance pipeline. All workflows paused until certified custodian signature is recorded, in less than 2 hours. The company had gone from bragging about modernization to not being able to send a single file. I walked to my living room window and watched the quiet street outside, letting the chill settle in my chest. Cold wasn't a feeling anymore. It was my operating mode. Around 11, my phone buzzed again. I answered this time, mostly out of curiosity. The CEO's voice came through, strained, cracking around the edges. "Miles, we need you on a call, please." The please was new. So was the desperation behind it when I joined the virtual meeting. Every face on the screen looked bruised. The CEO leaned forward and spoke with the careful tone of someone tiptoeing through a minefield. "Miles, just one signature. That's all we need. One. And everything goes back to normal." I kept my expression flat. I don't belong there anymore. Remember, he opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. This isn't about feelings. It's about survival. I almost laughed at that. "Instead," I said. "Exactly," before he could respond. A new alert flashed across my screen, a federal message stamped in red. I opened it slowly, savoring the timing. Contract will be terminated in 48 hours if valid attestation is not provided. I didn't have to read it aloud. The system automatically distributed copies to everyone on the call. I watched the CEO's face drain of color as the words appeared in front of him. His nephew, seated beside him, burst into tears, loud, full-bodied sobs that echoed through the speakers. The CEO slammed a fist on the table, rattling whatever confidence he had left. "This is a disaster," he choked out. Meanwhile, I simply sat there, upright and calm, like the eye of the storm. The chaos wasn't mine. The consequences weren't mine. They had disconnected me from their world, and now that world was cracking under the weight of its own choices. 48 hours, I murmured quietly, more to myself than to them. Cold clarity, firm distance, and deep down, the faintest flicker of dark amusement. I won't go into detail about what happened before. That's for the viewer to focus on. They scheduled the meeting in the largest conference room, as if size alone could mask the desperation leaking through every crack. I walked in without hurry, the kind of steady pace that unsettles people who expect either anger or fear. Instead, I brought silence cold, controlled, impossible to read. The CEO sat at the head of the table, flanked by two attorneys who looked like they'd aged 10 years overnight. His nephew sat a few chairs down, shoulders slumped, face blotchy from whatever meltdown he'd had before I arrived. "Thank you for coming." "Miles," the CEO said, voice trembling just enough to betray him. We need to clear up some matters." "Of course," I replied calmly. "Clarity is important." One of the lawyers cleared his throat. "There appears to be a discrepancy with federal registration. The system won't acknowledge the designated successor." The nephew swallowed hard, hands twisting together. "It's because the system wouldn't let me register." He finally blurted out, "I tried 3 times. It kept saying, unauthorized." I let the words hang for a moment, absorbing the mixture of embarrassment and fear dripping off him. "Unauthorized," I repeated, slowly. "That must have been uncomfortable for you." He looked down at the table, shame tightening his features. I set my laptop on the table and opened it with deliberate calm. Let's save everyone some time. A few taps later, I logged into the federal custodianship portal, still active, still flawless, still mine, when the dashboard loaded. The screen displayed the message that had quietly held the company hostage for days. Active officer, Miles Porter, replacement none. The CEO's breath hitched. The lawyers leaned forward as if proximity might change the words. The nephew stared at the screen like it had personally betrayed him. "This," I said softly, "is what continuity looks like. Not a title, not an announcement, a record." The CEO's voice cracked. "Miles, please, we're asking you to help." I tilted my head, studying him the way you might study someone who had once seemed larger than life, only to shrink under the weight of reality. "Help," I echoed. I remember asking for something once, respect. Wasn't it I also remember getting dismissed in front of 26 people? His mouth opened, but nothing came out. I turned the laptop slightly so everyone could see the glowing declaration, the one they had been trying so hard to work around. "I stood where he's sitting now," I said, nodding toward the nephew, except when it happened to me. I didn't cry. I just walked out the door. Silence rippled through the room, heavy, suffocating, absolute, and in that silence, my calm didn't waver, it sharpened, because this time, the power wasn't borrowed. It was mine. Walking out of the building felt different this time, lighter, almost weightless, as if the air itself had decided I no longer needed to carry anything for that company ever again. I didn't rush. I didn't look back. I simply stepped outside, let the door swing shut behind me, and felt something uncoil inside my chest. Freedom doesn't always arrive with celebration. Sometimes it slips in quietly, like an overdue breath. I made it halfway across the parking lot before my phone buzzed with the first alert. Stock dropped 38% in a single trading day. I stared at the number for a moment, blinking at the sheer scale of it. They always said the company was too stable to fail. Apparently, all it took was removing one person they thought was replaceable. The irony was almost poetic. By the time I reached my car, the second alert hit. Our largest partner, one I had maintained for over a decade, had officially terminated their contract. The message was short, formal, and brutally clear due to compliance instability and custodial uncertainty. "We are dissolving our agreement effective immediately." That was corporate language for "you broke it, don't call us." I leaned against my car door, letting the sunlight warm my face. Relief washed over me, not because they were suffering, but because I finally wasn't responsible for holding everything together anymore. It was amazing how heavy a burden can feel only after you put it down. The next notification wasn't a surprise either. The board had convened an emergency session and demanded the CEO resign, apparently. Firing the one person the federal government relied on wasn't a strategic masterpiece. I could imagine the scene: vividly raised voices, red faces, and the CEO trying and failing to explain how he let a personal decision escalate into a multi-million-dollar disaster, somewhere in that chaos. The nephew vanished from the company altogether. No forwarding email, no announcement, no goodbye message, just gone. Like someone blowing out a candle and pretending it had never been lit. I couldn't help but chuckle at the mental image of him sprinting through the parking lot with a cardboard box. I'd just opened my car door when the final alert arrived, a federal notice stamped in red. Contract terminated. No valid attestation received within compliance window. The timestamp caught my eye. The contract had been officially canceled 12 minutes after I stepped out of the building. 12 minutes. I let out a low laugh, shaking my head. Justice, I murmured. Sometimes uses a countdown timer, as I sat in the driver's seat. The last traces of tension slipped away. The company was collapsing behind me, but for the first time in years, I felt unburdened, no guilt, no responsibility, no weight pressing against my ribs. Only quiet satisfaction, edged with a hint of dark humor. They thought losing me wouldn't matter, turns out. The clock disagreed. The morning after the contract termination felt strangely calm, almost softer around the edges, as if the world had finally stopped leaning on me, for the first time in a long while. I woke up without that familiar weight in my chest, the one that came from holding together a project no one respected until it started breaking. I made coffee slowly, savoring the quiet, and sat by the window as sunlight stretched across the floor. It felt like the universe had exhaled with me. Around 9, my phone rang with a number I recognized instantly, a federal line. I answered, expecting a follow-up about the collapsed contract, but the voice on the other end was warm, steady, and surprisingly respectful. Mr. E. Porter. Good morning. We'd like to formally invite you to serve as an independent consultant for the new systems initiative. Your compensation would be triple your previous salary, with full discretion over your schedule. For a moment, I didn't speak, not out of shock, but because the quiet victory of it settled slowly, like a tide rising. They weren't calling because the company failed. They were calling because I mattered, because my work, my expertise, and my consistency had spoken louder than any boardroom decision or dismissive remark. I appreciate the offer, I finally said, and yes, I'd be happy to help. Not to prove anything, not to get even, but because it felt right and because I had earned it. After the call, I drove to a small hill overlooking the old building. It looked smaller from a distance, almost fragile, stripped of the authority it once tried to project. Cars rushed in and out of the parking lot, people scrambling to contain the mess left behind. I watched in silence, hands tucked into my pockets, letting the breeze brush past me. I gave them a chance, I said quietly. They threw it away themselves. There was no bitterness in the words, just truth. A simple, peaceful truth. I wasn't angry anymore. The hurt had faded, replaced by a quiet pride in everything I had endured and everything I had become because of it. Losing that job hadn't shattered me. It had freed me. The collapse that followed wasn't my burden to carry. It was the natural result of choices made by people who never understood the value of what they had. As I stood there, a sense of calm wrapped around me, steady, grounded, deeply satisfying. Not triumphant in a loud, gloating way, but triumphant in the way a storm eventually gives way to clear sky. I didn't need applause or recognition. The silence itself felt like affirmation. I turned away from the building, feeling the weight of the past finally loosen. A new chapter waited when I would enter, not as someone discarded, but as someone reclaimed, someone who had learned that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones you don't announce, the ones you simply step into. Sometimes life closes a door just so you can see how much strength you were carrying alone. And if my story reminds you of a moment you survived too, tell me, where are you listening from right now? Your voice matters here. If this chapter moved you, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, tap like, or pass the video to someone who needs the reminder. And don't forget, subscribe only if you're ready for more stories that speak the truth out loud.